Hello, welcome back to Bus Stops. My name is Nick. Let's dive into a picture at a bus stop. All right, we're going to close my eyes, do the old roulette wheel spin, and talk about this picture. All right, so I think this picture is a good time to talk about the rules of this project, because this was one picture where I contented myself to break the rules a little bit just to see how it goes. There's a lot of things that I tried in this project and am still trying because the project is still ongoing. I'm still photographing. But one of the rules that I gave myself early on was to only take one picture at every bus stop. That's a reasonable rule. It's more of a minimum than a maximum, quite honestly, because a lot of bus stops I show up at, and I would say 30% of the time I just don't see anything right away that I would normally want to photograph. And then I would say that number probably drops to 10% after I look for about 10 seconds. But yeah, it's rare that I ever arrive at a bus stop where I just am truly pulling my hair trying to figure out something to take a picture of. But this particular bus stop I'm thinking of, I wanted to bend the rules a little bit and see if I could make 10 pictures at one bus stop, just kind of go a whole order of magnitude up. I wouldn't recommend this approach. Well, I let me place some caveats on that. I have always, or definitely not always. Let me start from more of the beginning. In high school, when I got my first DSLR, Nikon D5100, back in 2010, I was prone to overshoot. I was prone to take 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 frames of a motionless scene when obviously one frame would have been perfectly fine. And in my sort of warped thinking at the time, I guess unformed thinking is the better way of saying it. In my unformed thinking at the time, I thought, well, if I take 2 pictures, one will be better than the other one, which means that I can decide later which one is the better one, which means that any given set of photos will necessarily get better the more pictures I take and the more options I have to choose from. That is so wrong that I hesitate to even repeat it into a microphone now 15 years later. The reason that's wrong is because if the differences truly matter that much between fractions of a second of different exposures, well, let me put it like this. That approach is actually probably okay in certain circumstances, primarily when photographing groups of people, even just 1 or 2 people. There are definitely moment-to-moment differences in the expressions, like sports is an obvious. You definitely want to take as many pictures as possible when photographing sports. However, for the kind of fussy, weird photographic undertaking that taking pictures like this is of a sidewalk with some grass and mashed up flowers, there is really absolutely no reason to take more than one exposure of this frame at a time. You'll drive yourself crazy. You'll run out of hard drive space. And I only kind of realized this in retrospect because I would look back on albums of photos that I took in high school and it might say, 263 pictures in this folder. But then I realized that really there are only 24 or fewer original ideas of compositions in that set. And so I would, it would make me feel crazy to look at old picture sets because I would want to just kind of find the nugget of the original idea that I was trying to photograph, and I'd have to wade through a lot of crap. And so for many years, my antidote to this thinking process was to shoot on film, especially large format film, where if you shoot, it's probably even more expensive now. In college, it cost me probably close to $10 per image to make a large format 4x5 color picture. A lot of pros and cons to this approach, but I think one of the biggest pros is that it at least was so expensive that it rooted out of me any semblance of thinking, well, I'll take as many pictures as I want to because I have a digital camera. And this is good. And this forces you to slow down. It forces you to treat each image with the preciousness that a scarce commodity like money dictates. But it also is cumbersome. Yeah, that's the biggest downside. When I shot large format color film, I would send off the sheets to be developed and in a lab, and there's a per sheet processing cost. There's the time of scanning it. Every film image has dust on it, so you have to clone stamp out all the dust in Photoshop to make it look like a good picture. And once I had done enough character development or whatever you want to call it through that process, I realized that I could just treat my digital camera like a film camera and begin to move in a better direction in my relationship with making still images. So that's kind of where I had this. I always have treated it with the mantra of like, make an original image each time you click the shutter. And so I really, really, really try hard to treat every digital image like a film negative, where, you know, if I'm taking 2 or 3 variations of a scene, I'm rearranging the composition each time. I'm going out of my way to ensure that the reason for creating multiple versions of the same scene was a good one. Otherwise, like if I have an idea, because not every idea is a good one, you can't edit your photos before you take them, essentially. And I mean edit in the sense of assembling an album of greatest hits, of rating 1 to 5 stars, that sort of thing. Macro editing. You can't do that before you take a picture. So sometimes you just got to take a picture and see where it lands. I took a lot of bad pictures with film, so that there's no guarantee of like having awesome pictures. All that's to say that trying to take that approach of creating an original, finely, minutely detailed image every time you click the shutter, and only one time per image, was a massive help in my photo making process. But like I said, with the bus stops, in most cases, one frame was the minimum, not the maximum. It was a maximum too, but I wasn't like chomping at the bit to go off and make more than one picture. However, one day I found that I was at a bus stop that seemed not only that there were interesting things to photograph, but that there were multiple different types of interesting things to photograph. I could probably make different variations of this exact scene with a curb and this little shoot of grass and some flowers. I could probably make a lot of different variations of this scene, and with minor differences, but the whole basic idea would be the same. Really, there was this idea, there were some cool buildings, you know, there was water on the ground because it had rained recently, so there were interesting reflections. And I just thought, you know, why not give it a shot? The whole trick about original photos is that just because you take a lot of them doesn't mean that your hit rate necessarily goes up, or even rather, I think it was Ansel Adams that said it was Ansel Adams that said 10 good photos in a year is a good crop. And that was back in the days when he was shooting even bigger film than I was in college. So, you know, he had to work even harder to get pictures than I did, unsurprisingly. And so for him, 10 good photos, that is a bumper crop. I mean, he had big glass plates that he lugged around and loaded down donkeys with his photographic equipment. So that's pretty impressive, honestly. You know, I hope to have more than 10 good pictures in a year because I don't have to involve donkeys in my photographic process. In any case, the sentiment is correct in that we take far more bad pictures than we take good pictures. However, that is not a ratio that necessarily expands. That is not a ratio that can survive multiplication easily. In other words, if I go out and I spend a day photographing at bus stops, if I go to 10 different stops, make 10 different pictures, and one of those pictures is really excellent, I am stoked. It doesn't mean that I can take 10 pictures at each of those 10 stops and get 10 excellent pictures. It's a interesting balance to act because you'll wear yourself out if you spend too much time trying to photograph yourself up a brick wall, if that makes sense. Right. So nonetheless, like just because this stop was interesting, I was like, all right, well, let's go 10 pictures. And a corollary of this whole one picture at a stop rule is that I do my very, very best to do all of my editing on site. And I know I just said you can't edit before you take the picture, but what I mean is I don't ever want to walk away from a bus stop with 2 or 3 candidates of a good picture and then just say, okay, well, I'll decide later. I really want to try to make that determination on the field because a lot of times I think it's good to be okay with missing something. I think digital photography especially can lend the mind to the pathology that you should capture everything because you don't know when it's going to be useful. At least that's been a struggle that I've had to fight against, not only in my fine art photographic practice, but even how I photograph friends and family. You know, there's this sense that if you photograph something, you can bottle it up for later, but you can certainly bottle up the appearance of it, but you won't be able to bottle up what people mean to you. And you'll be very sad down the line. Again, speaking from personal experience, you'll be sad down the line if you spend more time looking at pictures of people than you do when you can actually spend time with them. Slight philosophical detour, but important to say, and also very important for fine art photography. If you refuse to make decisions while you're shooting, then the decisions won't become easier down the line. And so I found that it's helpful to plant your flag in the ground and say, this picture is the one that's going to to come back to my studio. This is the one that I'm going to use for this bus stop. I think that taking bunches of pictures and bunches of ideas at a bus stop and say, well, I'll decide later. Like don't stretch out decisions like that, at least in my experience. Again, I'm partially just telling you how to make the exact project that I made. So if you have a strong reaction in the negative sense to what I just said, like by all means, forge ahead. We're different people. We have different minds. Not everything is universally applicable, but I hope that there is at least some kernel of wisdom in what I'm trying to say. This picture, we haven't talked anything about this picture, or hardly anything. This picture is obviously of a curb in the road. This texture of concrete, like the whole time I've been talking, my eye has been going back and forth between this little rock right here, which kind of almost looks like a tube, and then just the very edges of this grass as they kind of dance around and in between these dark shapes, which have less of a determinate character. And then also this kind of crack, which traces from there and then kind of intersects with this telephone pole reflection. I hope that there's like a delicacy and a minimalism to the shapes that are in this photo. Obviously, there's like big shapes, like this kind of swooping curb, and then how that sort of interfaces with this, the bend of this puddle. It has kind of like a nice Y, like an organic curve meeting this organic curve. And then this sort of implies a triangle that travels off the right side of the frame. Like these two lines will converge, probably half of a frame to the right. And then it sort of opens up into this space, kind of lets your eye bounce back and forth between all the detail. If this photo is successful, I don't know I can't tell you how to make this photo. I can try. I can describe the things that I'm seeing, and like I can talk about how, I don't know, like the evenness of this lighting is interesting to me. There's no harshness in this photo really at all. And you can actually tell, like, I think I caught the sun. The sun is like behind this cloud. So there's a kind of like a reflection of a hazy cloud in that puddle. And I think kind of just because of the pointed highlights, it's a hazy cloud. It's not like an overcast cloud. And so there was still directionality somewhat to the light. There was like a localized intensity to the light in the sky. And I think that's how you get this kind of, it's like a soft box glow all over this picture. Tiny little points of light kind of on the edge of that puddle. Yeah, and let me tell you, I've taken hundreds of versions of this picture, which are not as interesting as this one. I actually, again, trying to, along the lines of not saying I like it or I don't like it, I like this photo, but it's a photo, I'm not going to say challenging. That sounds really, it's not a challenging photo, but it is a photo that you have to look at for a little bit, and it's easy to just sort of disregard as unimportant. And I'm not asking you to think of it as the most important thing, but I hope that if you've been sitting here listening to me talk, and if you are not just podcasting this, but actually looking at the picture as we talk about it, I hope that you've begun to see a little bit of meaning within the picture as well. Not meaning, but just kind of visual beauty. This picture really doesn't mean much. I mean, we can say a lot. There's a lot of things that we can say in proximity to this photo that you might nod your head as I say them about cities and nature and the loveliness of materials. Like, all those things are fine to say. I just wouldn't say that this photo takes much of an editorial stance on any of those things. It just is a pretty composition to look at, and I am completely okay with that. There are plenty of other pictures in this series that I could make a better case that they have some kind of intellectual or ideological position, but this photo is not. It's not that picture. It's just nice. It's just nice. Yeah, I've described some of the more interesting elements of this picture. I've described why this photo sits within the series in the way it does. And yeah, I mean, I think that I'll just tell you, I mean, I walked away from that time that I photographed 10 pictures at one stop, and I didn't feel an urgency. I haven't done it since. It was like kind of midway through from where the project started to where I am now. And I haven't done it since. Maybe I'll do it again if I find a stop that really has a lot of things that are screaming to be photographed. But in most instances, I am content to let one picture be the one that I walk away with. And I hope that the things I've said about all of that make sense. Anyway, thanks for listening.